My first car was a 1989 Chevy Beretta that I got while it was heavily used. And by my first car, I mean the car my parents bought for me when I was driving and allowed me to drive it. It had a sunroof, but it would leak, so it was glued shut. It had just a random gash missing out of the dash. And I drove that car for a little over a year and a half. And then while I was driving it, it would just stop running. Originally, we thought, okay, we just had to warm up the engine a little bit more, but after this happened a few times, my mom was like, all right, we can't have our son driving a car that just dies while he's driving it. So I got to use a new car. And it wasn't brand new. It was new to us. And I was like, all right, I like this car. I like this car a lot. And my dad gave me the keys to it, and I got to use it anytime that I wanted until I got in trouble. And then it became very clear the dynamic that was going on. Anytime I got in trouble, he was quick to remind me that I did not, in fact, own the car, that he owned the car. And I had the privilege of using what he had given to me, but he could take it away at any moment that he so desired. And so the implication was it was a good idea to fly under the radar and not get in any serious trouble that would get the car taken away. Like, that's just the way that the dynamic played out. And what I recognized was I'm able to use this, but it can be taken away at a moment's notice. And this morning, we're going to see that dynamic played out. Not in terms of an automobile, but in terms of a kingdom. I'm giving you the end before we even get there. But what we learn along the way has implications, because the reality is, I don't think any of us sitting in this room are going to be king or queen one day. But the reality is there are implications for us that we can take from learning through what Belshazzar encountered and endured and how Daniel reacted. Last week we started looking at the first part of Daniel chapter 5, and today we're going to finish it. So if you have your phones or your tablets, I'd invite you to follow along with us this morning in the Bible app. It's a free resource that you can find in whatever app store you utilize on your device. Just type in Bible, download the YouVersion Bible app, and then there are a number of incredible features. Everything in that app is free. I know there are some Bible apps that want you to pay for them, but this is an entirely free app, and there's a feature that we use together each and every week called the Events feature. Go to the Events feature and either enable your locations or right in Lakeside, Algoma will pop up, and you can follow along with us that way. If you have a traditional Bible with you, we are journeying through the Old Testament book of Daniel. Today we're going to be in the second part of Daniel chapter 5, and if you're joining us via the stream this morning, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Brian. I'm part of the team here at Lakeside, and the verses will be available for you on the screen below. Now, as we've been journeying through the book of Daniel so far, what we have seen is we've seen two different kings. First, there's King Nebuchadnezzar, and we saw King Nebuchadnezzar throughout the first 4 chapters of the book of Daniel. He's the one that led the siege of Judah, brought Daniel back as a political prisoner, put him into his service, and then he's the one who had the dreams that we saw in Daniel chapter 2 and then in Daniel chapter 4. Now, some time has passed, as we talked about last week. He's been dead for about 20 years. And Belshazzar is one of the rulers of the kingdom. And we saw last week that there was a feast. There was a party that was being had, and it was a feast all dedicated to excess. And in the midst of all of that, a human hand appeared and wrote a message on a wall. And Belshazzar was greatly troubled by this, and he desperately wanted to know what it meant. And nobody could tell him what it meant. And then someone said, go get Daniel. He was able to give interpretations to Nebuchadnezzar. Find him. He'll be able to give you the message. Daniel's brought in. Belshazzar offers him prestige and power and wealth. And Daniel says, I don't want any of those things, but I will still interpret what the message means. And that's where we left off last week and where we pick up today in Daniel chapter 5, beginning in verse 18, where we read these words, and this is Daniel. O King, the Most High God, gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Daniel begins the explanation of what the message is by pulling out and reminding Belshazzar how God has worked in the kingdom before. He gave Nebuchadnezzar your father. He writes back and he says, let's look at the history. Let's look at the history. Let's look at your lineage. Let's recall what God has done. And he says, God is the one who gave Nebuchadnezzar position, power, and prestige. And remember how fascinating this is. Because in Daniel chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar's forces came and they raided Judah. They ransacked the place. And yet we see that it is ultimately God who gave Nebuchadnezzar his position, his power, and his prestige. And because, verse 19 says, because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed. And whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up. Whom he would, he humbled. This is fascinating to me. That God gives Nebuchadnezzar his position and his power, the authority, the greatness that God gave him. And his kingdom was so great that people all over the world feared Nebuchadnezzar. God established him in that position. And simultaneously, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to operate with free will. Those he'd kill. Those he'd keep alive. Those he chose to raise up, he'd raise them up. Those he chose to humble, he humbled them. God simultaneously puts Nebuchadnezzar in a position, but let him function as he decided to choose. Now, this will drive you insane if you try to understand this. If you try to understand exactly how this works, that God can elevate someone to a position and then allow them to operate freely with their own desire and do whatever they want, but still somehow go according to God's plan and his purposes, you're going to drive yourself mad. Because it is too big for us to understand. The prophet Isaiah says, God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and God's ways are not our ways. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are God's thoughts above our thoughts, and God's ways higher than our ways. And we've been able to create and design some really fantastic things, and yet there are things that just blow our minds. So how can we understand this? How can we try to wrap our minds around this? Because this has implications for us. That God can put us in positions, he can put us in places. But that doesn't mean that we're robots. It doesn't mean that we don't have any say in the matter. It doesn't mean that we don't get to operate. But how does all of this work? So I want to give you a picture, and it's not a perfect picture. And if you want to theologically poke holes in it, trust me, there will be plenty of ways that you can poke holes in it, so don't overthink it. But a way that I'm trying to help you understand this is when our boys were younger, we had a glorious set amount of time each and every day called nap time. It was just a beautiful, beautiful thing for them and for especially one of us parents. It was needed. One of us parents needed it more than the other. And one of our sons was incredible. Like you would lay him down, his eyes would close, and that's the son that takes after me. And then you have the other son, and you would lay him down and be like, what are you doing? And it's like, it's time for you to get some rest. I'm not tired. Well, see, here's the thing. You are. Because if you don't sleep now, you're going to fall asleep at 4:30 tonight. And then I'm going to try to wake you up for dinner, and you're not going to want to wake up for dinner. And then you're going to cry when I wake you up, and then your mom's going to be like, oh, just let him sleep for a little bit longer. But then he's not going to want to wake up then either. And then he's going to be wide awake at 3:30 in the morning, which isn't going to behoove any of us. So let's just take a little rest now, okay, champ? And then everybody will have a much better night and day tomorrow. Well, I don't want to do that. And so you run into this struggle. And I know some people are like, well, that means they didn't need a nap anymore. Well, maybe that's true, but I needed them to have a nap. Thank you very much. So they were going to have a nap. So the arrangement that we finally came up with is, all right, you're going to be in your room for this amount of time. Now, what you want to do in your room during this amount of time, I don't want to hear you. I don't want to hear you. But what you do in there, that's your choice. Some days, he'd play with toys. Some days, he'd lay by the door and put his fingers under the door like he was a cat. And like he planning a jailbreak. I'm not really sure what all was going on there. Some days, he'd sleep. And that was the arrangement that we ultimately came up with, is this is a time, this is where you're going to be placed. Now, what you do in terms of your confinement is up to you. In a way similar to that, God will put us in places and allow us to operate within the guardrails and restrictions that He ultimately puts in place. Does that mean that everything Nebuchadnezzar did brought honor and glory to God? Well, if you've been joining us over the course of the last number of weeks, you know the answer to that. Absolutely not. But God puts us in positions and simultaneously allows us to function within our own free will in somehow and in some way in God's glorious design that is greater than what I can fully and adequately explain to you. It all works together for His purpose and according to His plan. And then Daniel continues in verses 20 and 21. But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom He will. Nebuchadnezzar assembled an incredible kingdom, and we saw in Daniel chapter 4 that as Nebuchadnezzar looked out over everything that was built and was present in his kingdom, his heart swelled with pride, even though God had warned him. And instantly he was driven out of his kingdom into a period of madness for a number of years, when Nebuchadnezzar failed to realize God's role in what he had done and instead became full of pride. God humbled him. Daniel chapter 4. Then we get to verse 22. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. And you, Belshazzar, you knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar, you knew the kingdom that had been assembled and the period of time that he was gone. And still you chose pride. I want to talk to you, especially if you're younger. Learn from your parents' mistakes. Learn from your parents' mistakes. Sometimes, especially when you're a teenager and you're having those battles with your parents because you think they're some of the dumbest people that God has ever put on this earth, and you're so much smarter than them. And you can't believe all the intelligence that God supernaturally gave you, because when you look at your parents, you're like, well, these idiots didn't give it to me, so I don't know where it came from, but it certainly wasn't them. And in the midst of all of that, you just repeat a cycle of mistake because you think, well, they did it, and it turned out okay for them. Parents, humbly, grandparents too, humbly acknowledge your mistakes. Now, you don't have to sit them down and go into graphic detail, but it needs to be more than like a Today Show interview style conversation with your kid, where you just brush past everything negative and, oh yeah, here are all the highlights. Don't just give your kids the highlights. Share with them your struggles. Share with them things that you've had to learn the hard way. Share with them mistakes that you've made and the lessons learned along the way. Allow them to see you vulnerable. Allow them to see that you've had to go through some really challenging circumstances that if you made a different choice, you wouldn't have had to endure. Be vulnerable and be honest with them. Acknowledge these things. Acknowledge the things that you'd change, even about yourself today. Acknowledge the ways that you wish you were better. And humbly have those conversations. And sometimes it's going to feel like this is a waste of my time. They're not listening. And the reality is you can't make anyone listen. You can offer consequences. You can create environments for people to listen. But at the end of the day, you can't force anyone to act wisely. But what you can do is you can be willing to share with them the struggles and the mistakes that you have made along the way and hope that they will learn from that and grow from it and not have to endure the same pain that you have had to endure in the process. Let them see you vulnerable. Now, certainly there's age appropriateness to this, and there's a dynamic that you have to consider, but at some level, make it a practice throughout their development to just let them know, hey, here's some mistakes that I've made along the way. Here's some lessons that I have had to learn along the way. And I think one of the ways to really develop the age appropriateness about that is to think about yourself when you were at the age where you made the mistake, and then go a year or two before the age you were at that time and have that conversation. Or if it's something that they're dealing with and it's impacting their daily existence now, then that's probably the time to have the conversation with them. And if your parents are vulnerable and if they're honest, then in humility, shut up and learn from them. Don't sit there and think, well, I've got it all figured out. This isn't going to apply to me. Because I promise you, you don't have it all figured out. And the moment you think, well, I could never do that, is the moment you set yourself up for disaster. So parents, grandparents, be willing to talk about your wounds. Kids, be willing to listen and break the cycle. Don't feel like you have to walk through the same mistakes and the same regrets, but learn from their mistakes. Belshazzar, he saw the collateral damage, he knew about it, and yet he chose to operate in the exact same way, with the exact same pride that Nebuchadnezzar had operated in. And how often is that the reality of our stories? That even though we see the warnings, even though we see the damage, we still choose to operate in the wrong way. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. The reality is, pride positions us against God every single time. And the message of Daniel to Belshazzar is this: Belshazzar, you have worshiped worthless things. You've worshiped worthless things. We talked about it last week. This is a story of excess. It's a story of sex. It's a story of fame. It's a story of wealth. It's a story of power and prestige. And it isn't anything new in our society. We see it all the time. But the reality is it's as old as humanity. And Daniel says, Belshazzar, your aim and your focus was on your power, on what you could acquire, on what you could achieve, on who you could have a relationship with, on your reputation, on everything that you owned. This is what you chased after, and these are the things that so many people chase after, even though we know it ultimately always leads to emptiness. It's never, ever enough, and yet people continue to chase. And Daniel says, Belshazzar, you chased after the women, you chased after the kingdom, you chased after the money. You chased after all the power that you had, everything that you could acquire. And in the process, you neglected the God who created you. And you neglected the God who has made it possible for you to have your last breath. In all these things that you have chased after, you have neglected the one thing that really matters. And your heart has become proud. That's the thing. You're happy to live where you live. You're happy to be in the position that you're in. And you're so blind to the fact that you need God in your life because of everything that you have. And yet ultimately, those things are never enough. Then from his presence, verse 24 begins, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, tekel, and parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar, the God whom you have neglected has ended your rule. The God whom you didn't think you needed is delivering your kingdom to another. The God that you have blindly ignored is fed up. And he has had enough. And he is going to work and show that ultimately he is the one who owns it all. He is the one who is in control of who's in control. He is the one who appoints kings and rulers. He is the one who establishes kingdoms and nations. He is the one who can tear you down. The God who you have neglected has ended your rule and delivered your kingdom to another. Then Belshazzar gave the command. And Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, I'm fascinated by this, Because Belshazzar has just been told news that if you're king, you don't want to hear. At a party in front of all of the noble people and all of the powerful people in the country, with all of his wives and all of his concubines there, and then this hand appears out of nowhere, and it writes this message on the wall, and he says, I need to know what this message means. They bring in Daniel. Daniel provides the interpretation that ultimately says, your kingdom's going to end. And Belshazzar still gives Daniel the things that Daniel earlier in chapter 5 said, I don't even desire them. You can save your money. You can save the position. You can save everything that you've offered. And yet here, Belshazzar still demands that these things are given to Daniel, even though Daniel has just delivered horrific news. Now, on the surface, this makes very little sense. Until you remember one thing. It's God that establishes kings, and it's God that establishes kingdoms. It's God that puts people in power and in position. And it's God that removes people from power and from position. And if you look at this strictly from a human element and from a human way, and you see that Belshazzar still gives Daniel all these things, you think to yourself, that's really interesting, because I'm sure this is a message that he did not want to be given. But when you zoom out and you remember, it is God who elevates those whom he desires to elevate, then it makes a little more sense. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. That very night, the night that this hand mysteriously appeared and wrote a message on the wall, that very night, there was a fulfillment of the earlier part of Daniel 5, of the silver that we saw in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. Belshazzar was killed, and the Medes and the Persians began ruling over the region. What are the implications for us? Well, let's start corporately and nationally before we talk personally. The reality is this, and we see this throughout Scripture, certainly highlighted in the book of Daniel, highlighted other places as well. But let us always remember that God is in control of who's in control. Whether it is a dictator or a democracy, nothing happens outside of the permission and the will of God. So whether that means your team's in power right now or your team's out of power right now, you can take heart in knowing that ultimately God is the one who holds all of the real power. And that's our hope. That's our hope. Again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be engaged in the process. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak out our mind. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't protest or get involved or register people to vote or any of those things. But it does mean that if your hope at the end of the day is in your political ideology, you are never going to be satisfied. And it's never going to be enough. And you're ultimately never going to find peace. Because the solution to the greatest problems that we face is not solved through policy. It is solved when we recognize that we have a desperate need to connect with the God who created us. And the people around us have that very same need. Now let's talk individually. Are we guilty of the same thing of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar? Do we look at what we've accomplished and what we've achieved through our hard work, through our effort, through our energy? And do we think, wow, look at what I've built? This is pretty impressive. Look at what I've accomplished. And in the process, subtly diminish the role that God and His blessing have played every step along the way of our journey. Or maybe you live in an area where you feel like, no, I don't struggle with the pride, but I struggle with the bitterness. Because of the people who've been pushed in front of me. Because I see what they're capable of, and I see how they react, and I see how they respond, and I know what I'm capable of, and it's just the fact that this person doesn't like me, or this promotion was not given to me, and all of a sudden, the heart becomes bitter. And if you feel invisible, and you feel unseen, and you feel overlooked, and you feel neglected, I just want to remind you that it is ultimately God who places us in positions. And sometimes God lovingly keeps us from the things we want the most. Because His purpose and His plan is greater for us than we can even fathom. And while we don't see all of the reasons and all the factors, and we may never on this side of eternity, and who knows if we even will on the other side of eternity. If you live in the area of bitterness right now, because you feel looked over, because you feel passed over, if that is where you find yourself, and that is where you live today, the question I want you to really grapple with and really wrestle with is, do you really believe that God is ultimately in control of all things? And if the answer to that question is yes, then do you ultimately believe that God really does desire what's best for you? Because the reality is, a lot of us will say, God, I know you know what's best for me. And the reality of our hearts and our lives a lot of times is, God, I know what's best for me. And that's where bitterness grows. And what I'm fascinated with is that Daniel says, Belshazzar, you keep all this stuff. But God had a different plan. And so even in the midst of giving a horrible message, Daniel is still given what God wanted him to have. If you find yourself in a place today where you're bitter, be reminded that God is still sovereign and He's still in control. If you find yourself today in a place where you're thinking, man, I've done pretty good, I've built all this, humble your heart today before it is humbled for you. And if you've been chasing after the fame and the wealth and the power and the prestige, just know it's an empty pursuit. You can accomplish it all, and it still isn't going to be enough. Because you were created for a far greater purpose. And if you're wrestling with any of those things, I just want you to know we're here to help. I'd love to talk with you, to pray with you, and point you in the direction of a more fulfilling and rewarding life. God, I pray that that's what we would experience. I pray in a world that tries to get us to chase after so many things, we would refuse to chase after anything that will ultimately only lead us empty. God, I pray for the person here that is chasing after the excesses of this world, that believes they'll find their satisfaction in relationships, wealth, the next move they can make professionally, how big their portfolio can be. God, I pray that they would discover something so much greater, which is available to us because of the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus. That they would live for you, God. I pray for the person that's done really well for themselves, but has lost sight of the fact of your role in it. And I pray that they would be quick to humble their hearts and thank you for every good and perfect gift that you've given them. I pray for the bitter, feel they've been overlooked and passed over. And I pray, God, that your Spirit could encourage your hardened, bitter heart. God, give them a glimpse of what you're accomplishing and what you're doing through a situation and circumstance that they might not even want to be in. But God, I pray that you would help them see. Show us our need for you and help us walk with you daily. Be glorified in our lives, Jesus. It's in your name we pray.